This episode contains graphic content that may not be suitable for all ages. Listener discretion is advised. If you or someone you know is struggling or in crisis, help is available. Call or text 988 or chat with someone at 988lifeline.org. Those outside of the US, reach out to someone at your local crisis center or hotline. Please do not suffer in silence.
24-year-old male. No weapons were seen. There are a total of 4 people in the apartment. Also noted that it smells like bleach.
At around 5:30 p.m. on Friday, January 17th, 2020, police were called to an apartment in Ballston, Virginia. Initial reports suggested that a young man was in cardiac arrest, with blood coming from his upper extremities, but as authorities would learn, that was not the case. By the time medics and police arrived at the scene, the young man was already dead. The 24-year-old man's body had been discovered in his bed by his sister, who he lived with at the time. The sister, also a young adult, had some friends in town visiting for the long weekend, and tried to rouse her brother from inside his bedroom that afternoon. When he failed to respond, she opened the door to his room and found him. A call to 911 followed immediately thereafter. A press release from the Arlington County Police Department would read as follows. Upon arrival, an adult male victim was located deceased inside a residence. Cause of death will be determined by the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner. This remains an active criminal investigation, and the preliminary investigation has not revealed an immediate threat to the community. A follow-up statement the following Tuesday would confirm this death as the first homicide of the year for the Arlington County PD. Following an autopsy by the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner, the suspicious death has been ruled a homicide, with the victim suffering trauma to the upper body. The victim has been identified as Scott Ratigan, 24, of Arlington, Virginia. Scott Wayne Ratigan was born on September 15, 1995 in Fairfax, Virginia, about 20 miles west of Washington, D.C. to his parents, John and Linda. He would grow up in nearby Gainesville, another 20 miles to the west, roughly 45 minutes away from D.C. He had 2 sisters, Stephanie and Colleen, who he would remain close with throughout his brief life. In adolescence, Scott would become a bit of an accomplished athlete, playing both football and lacrosse for Battlefield High School. There he was well-liked and, by all accounts, was a well-rounded student who seemed poised to have a promising future. Scott went on to attend Radford University between 2014 and 2018, which was still in Virginia, just over on the western side of the state, more than 200 miles away from his hometown, Gainesville. There, he became the vice president of the Sigma Chi fraternity and ultimately graduated with a degree in business management. After graduating from college, Scott began to settle into the Washington D.C. region, in particular in Ballston, a neighborhood of Arlington, Virginia, located just across the Potomac from D.C. itself. For those that have never been, this is a densely populated area full of high-rise office and apartment buildings, some of which Scott worked and lived in. There, Scott worked as a recruiter for Insight Global for a few months, before taking on a new position as an account executive with Konica Minolta Business Solutions, a company that specializes in business and industrial imaging products, such as copiers, laser printers, etc. AKA the type of company that doesn't raise many eyebrows but provides steady employment. As he settled into his adult life, Scott lived in an apartment at the AVA Ballston Square building, located at 850 North Randolph Street, near Wilson Boulevard. He lived there along with his sister, who was unfortunately one of the 4 people in the apartment that fateful afternoon in January of 2020, when Scott's body was found inside of his bedroom. The investigation into Scott's homicide was immediately overseen by the aforementioned Arlington County Police Department, who continue to spearhead the case today. They were called to Scott's apartment at approximately 5:30 on January 17, 2020, and were immediately alerted to a strange indicator of a crime at the scene. The early police scanner audio, which you heard at the top of the episode, reported that 4 people were inside of the apartment at the time of the discovery. It's never been officially reported, but it's widely believed that these 4 people were Scott's sister and her friends, who were in town visiting for the long holiday weekend, with the following Monday being Martin Luther King Jr. Day. The audio from the police scanner also revealed that there was a strong smell of bleach inside the apartment, likely isolated within Scott's bedroom. To police at the scene, this indicated that this had not only been a homicide, but that the offender, whoever they were, had attempted to cover up evidence of their involvement. Since Scott's body had not been hidden in any way, the offender had undoubtedly done so to destroy their own forensic evidence, DNA of some kind. No murder weapon was recovered at the crime scene, but the vague reports released by authorities informed the public that there was blood present on Scott's neck, hands, and mouth, likely due to stab wounds. The autopsy would confirm that he had died from upper body trauma, with his death having been a homicide, but no specific details would get released in the immediate future. Police claimed that the public had no need to be concerned, indicating that they had an idea of how the crime unfolded, or that the killer had specifically targeted Scott. Yet in the weeks to come, additional details would not follow. In fact, police would only ever make sporadic releases to the public about this case, not many of which were very informative. John Ratigan, Scott's father, would later tell reporters with Fox 5, "Somebody tragically killed him. We don't know who, we don't know why." Various theories regarding the killer's motive would swirl around this case in the weeks and months to come, as more specific details of Scott's death and his final hours remained shielded by investigators. Of course, theories regarding drug use or debts followed closely in the wake of the crime. More often than not, these rumors are usually based in very little fact, as most drug dealers want to avoid suspicion, and the easiest way to do that is to not murder someone, especially in such a unique way. To that end, there seems to be little to no evidence linking Scott to drugs in any way. He was a collegiate athlete and, by all accounts, was a relatively straight-laced young man. If he was involved in the seedy world of illegal drugs, it wasn't something that seems to have been known about him. For that reason, I find it unlikely that he was targeted by violent drug dealers, to the point of being stabbed to death in his own apartment just outside of the nation's capital. Besides, it wasn't like Scott was hurting for money. A young professional living in D.C., Scott came from a relatively well-to-do family, and if he owed an extreme amount of money to drug dealers or even bookies, he likely could have gotten the money to pay them. Also, this needs to be said, but drug dealers and illegal bookies usually aren't like the ones seen in gangster movies. They're often just opportunists. They're not repugnant criminals with a hair trigger and a proclivity for violence. Also, by killing someone, they eliminate almost any possibility of that debt being paid back. Scott being killed for a drug or a gambling debt is just, to me, it's kind of a stupid theory. And I hate that that theory infects so many unsolved cases in such a widespread way, as it usually does nothing but detract from the known facts. And more often than not, it becomes something that the loved ones' families have to defend against, as was the case in this story, with Scott's father having to tell reporters that this wasn't a drug-related crime. But other than this loose connection to the seedy world of drugs, another couple of theories emerged immediately after Scott's death, which indicated that the killer may have been someone known to Scott. Maybe someone from his past, or someone vying for part of his present. By 2020, Scott had been dating his girlfriend for quite a while, nearly an entire decade, dating back to their high school days, if not before. They'd reportedly been off and on for a bit, but were committed to each other by the time of Scott's murder and were reportedly deeply in love. Comments online have hinted at the stability of their relationship, but I'll refrain from including any specific details of those because they're little more than rumors at this point. Regardless, there's been a lot of speculation that Scott's killer may have been a romantic rival of sorts. Potentially someone that had taken an interest in Scott's girlfriend and singled him out, hoping to clear their own path. 4 years later, this remains possible, but police have released very little information about their potential suspects or persons of interest, so I can only assume that this is something investigators thoroughly investigated early on. What is apparent, though, is that from the outside looking in, Scott does not seem to be the type of guy that made a lot of enemies in his 24 years of life, which makes the first major development in this case all the more shocking. That's after the break. In January of 2021, 1 year after Scott Ratigan's murder, the Arlington County Police Department released a 42-second video on their YouTube channel and social media pages. This footage, albeit very brief, revealed footage of Scott's presumed killer for the first time, and showed them dressed head to toe in dark clothing and making their way to and from Scott's apartment that fateful Friday. The unknown subject was wearing a dark jacket or hoodie with the hood up, dark pants, black shoes with white soles, black Under Armour gloves, a dark facial covering of some kind, and a dark backpack. The backpack looks similar to many North Face bags, but the unsub had covered up the logo with duct tape, hinting at the brand name potentially being something more specific to them, maybe like a backpack from the company they worked at or such. It's also worth noting that they wore a neck gaiter to cover up most of their facial features, and did so in January of 2020, weeks before COVID-19 hit the United States and facial coverings became commonplace. The obscuring of their facial features and the covering up of most brands on their belongings indicated that they had likely thought about being seen by witnesses or cameras and had carefully considered their plan, thus revealing that they had likely premeditated Scott's death well ahead of time. It was still daylight when cameras captured this unknown individual coming to and from Scott's apartment, so we can only assume that they made their move sometime in the middle of the day. Since it was January, daytime hours were pretty limited, and the footage makes this appear to be the middle of the day, not sunrise or sunset, so likely sometime between, say, 11 a.m. and 3 p.m., give or take. This individual appears to have a smaller, thin build, with authorities estimating them to stand somewhere between 5'6" and 5'8", and weighing approximately 150 to 175 pounds. But most intriguingly, in the roughly 30 seconds of footage publicly released, they seem to have had a very peculiar and specific walk. They took very heavy, plodding footsteps and walked in a bow-legged fashion. In a press release accompanying the release of this footage, authorities described them as pigeon-toed, which is a condition that usually occurs in utero, with the way the legs are positioned inside the womb. This is something that usually has to be corrected during childhood, and is incredibly hard to cover up as an adult. This would result in the knee-knocking motion seen by the unknown subject in the video footage, with their feet moving together with almost every step. It's most noticeable to me when they're walking at a slower, normal speed, but is still noticeable when they speed up into a jog. From what I've learned about these leg movements, this is something that would be hard to fake in the moment, especially after committing a murder, when so many other things may be racing through an offender's mind, simply because it's such a unique leg movement. But it's unknown if investigators believe this pigeon-toed movement to be due to a developmental issue, or potentially something else. Maybe a leg injury, perhaps even a prosthetic leg, or a back injury of some kind. Without more detail, it's impossible to tell. After the release of this video footage, discussion over the gender of the unknown subject would commence in online forums, but in statements released by authorities, they would often refer to the offender as a male. To my eye, the unsub appears to look male in build and overall physique, but others think that certain angles or screenshots make them look feminine. I personally don't see it, but don't take my word for it, as I'm far from an expert in this matter, and you could watch the footage for yourself. Regardless, the release of this footage, roughly 1 year after Scott's murder, seemed to lead to more questions than answers. Despite providing a brief snapshot of the offender at the time of the crime, the public still knew relatively little about them, and it became more apparent that Scott had been targeted for some unknown reason. Yet, the main question remains: why? Whoever this unknown subject was, they had evidently been involved in the murder of Scott Ratigan on Friday, January 17th, 2020. By all indications, they had been the person to kill him, yet it was unknown how they had gained entry into Scott's apartment, whether they had been let in or somehow picked the lock. But considering this was a large apartment building, it was very unlikely that they kicked in a door or smashed a window, anything of that nature. I actually lived in the D.C. area at the time, albeit not in Ballston, but a few miles away over in Falls Church, Virginia, which is much more of a suburban area. However, I did have some friends that lived in apartment buildings just like Scott's, where you often needed to check in at a front desk or swipe a key card before being allowed to enter. But this was not a uniform security measure, nor was it stringently enforced. Often, entrances to these buildings would be left unlocked or unsupervised, or others would simply hold open the door for you when they were on their way in or out. On more than one occasion, when I'd go to visit my friends in nearby Arlington, I'd often be let in by just telling the employees at the front desk which apartment I was headed to. Only one made me sign in on a paper sheet, but it's not like they verified any of that information. I honestly could have written that I was Mickey Mouse there to meet Darth Vader in apartment 420, and they likely wouldn't have noticed. While Scott's apartment was the type where you needed to check in at the front desk, it wasn't ever really enforced by the building's employees. To make matters even more disconcerting, the cameras on Scott's floor were not working at the time, so no footage is believed to have been recovered showing how the unsub gained entry to his apartment. Comments online indicated that they had followed a resident inside a side door who had used a key fob to enter in. If so, then footage of them may not exist, since the building was actually in construction at the time and likely had entire floors or sections disconnected from the security system. However, this leads us into another surprising facet of the story. Scott, at the time of his murder, had just recently started a new job, but had taken that Friday off to get a jump on the extended holiday weekend. Had this unknown subject known that Scott would be home during the day? Or had this merely been a coincidence? I would personally be very interested to know why Scott had taken the day off, or who he had told, as that may explain the motivation behind this crime. If he had previously known the unsub, had he planned on meeting up with them? If so, why? Did he let the unsub into his apartment, or had he been caught unaware? Was this something that he wanted to hide from his loved ones? Or had he been caught by surprise while playing hooky? Since the offender had evidently premeditated the crime, it was very unlikely that this was a burglary gone wrong. However, I would be very curious to know what time the surveillance footage of the suspect walking along the street took place, as it may provide context on what Scott was up to at the time, and whether he had any correspondence with someone in the time frame surrounding it. The killer had evidently come to Scott's apartment ready and equipped for the task, with all of their clothing and belongings seeming to be new and/or in good condition. They had also been prepped by the killer to avoid being recognized, such as duct tape covering up the backpack's logo and the markings on their shoes being blacked out. They had also had the presence of mind to wear shoes with white soles, likely knowing that they would be less likely to leave scuff marks in case of a struggle. They had bundled up in layers, but still dressed athletically, as seen by them jogging in the surveillance footage, presumably after committing the crime. Yet this was all clothing that regular residents of the area would wear, with not much making them stand out. Of course, other than the neck gaiter pulled up to their face. Yet this being just a month or so before COVID-19 started spreading throughout the US, this might have just been seen as a precaution, as no one else near the unsub in the security footage seemed surprised to see them wearing it. After killing Scott, this individual then set out to cover up the crime, reportedly using bleach or something like it, maybe sodium hypochlorite, to destroy forensic evidence at the scene. Because of all the government facilities and businesses nearby the crime scene, it's possible that there exists more security footage showing this unsub heading to or fleeing Scott's apartment. Yet, if it does exist, none of it has been released over the past 3 years, with investigators' lips growing even tighter as the months have passed. The lack of any tangible motive makes this case even more frustrating to follow along with, since there seems to have been no reason for the unsub to target Scott. He came from an apparently stable family life. He had been in a steady relationship. He wasn't known to be into drugs or gambling or anything like that. He was a young professional in a field that wasn't sexy nor salacious, and had just started working there, so he was unlikely to have ruffled any feathers. Yet, for some unknown reason, he had been targeted by this unknown killer. Many speculate that this crime has all the hallmarks of a professional hit, but the question remains, why? Why target Scott, of all people? I can only think of a few realistic possibilities, given what we know now. I think it's possible that the unsub was someone who viewed Scott as a romantic rival of sorts. By getting rid of him, they would have more access to his girlfriend, or potentially even his sister. After all, Scott lived with his sister at the time, and the killer might have mistakenly assumed he was her boyfriend. It's also possible that there is some secretive part of Scott's life that remains closely guarded by his loved ones and investigators to this day. Perhaps something that's even so secretive they don't know about it, something that might remain guarded until the time charges are filed. Yet, that's just a possibility, one of which leads to all kind of salacious guessing games about what that secret may be. But that idea of there being some secret part of Scott's life seems more comforting in a way than the last realistic possibility. That being, of course, the idea that this crime was committed by someone with little to no previous connection to Scott. Someone with a knack for premeditation that had targeted him through little more than chance. If so, that indicates that Scott's death may not have been the unknown subject's first, and is unlikely to have been their last. Sadly, despite the 4-year mark of Scott's murder coming and going back in January, there has been little to no movement in the case over the past 3 years. At least, not publicly. The Arlington County Police Department remains very tight-lipped about every aspect of this case. So much so, in fact, that it's caused a bit of confusion from skeptics, who have decried the PD's lack of any public disclosures since the release of the surveillance footage back in early 2021. Many have also found it odd that authorities chose to release the 30 or so seconds of footage 1 year after Scott's murder, long after many memories of the day in question had faded from memory. By then, any memories of someone wearing dark clothing and a face mask outside of Washington, D.C. had likely been forgotten, due in no small part to the global pandemic that had overwritten so much of our public consciousness. Yet, authorities still refuse to divulge more information regarding Scott's case, with ACPD spokeswoman Ashley Savage telling the publication ARL Now earlier this year, 2024. "We want to assure the public that the investigation into identifying and holding responsible the suspect or suspects responsible for Scott Ratigan's homicide remains a top priority. To ensure the integrity of the ongoing investigation, there are no additional details to provide at this time. Detectives continue to follow up on investigative leads and will continue to evaluate the case for any possible future updates." I can only hope that the PD's reluctance to share any more information is for a reason, that they have a strong suspect in their line of sight. They've just been unable to pull the trigger, so to speak, on filing charges. That's my glass half full mentality, at least, because the alternative is more chilling, with the killer still walking, living, and breathing among us. A reward of $50,000 was established by Scott's loved ones in the months after his death, and is still available for any information that leads to the arrest and conviction of the suspect or suspects. Anyone with information is encouraged to watch the footage online. Links will be included in the episode description. You are encouraged to forward any potential information to the Arlington County Police Department. You can reach them through email at acpdtipline@arlingtonva.us or by phone at 703-228-4180. You can also report any information anonymously through Arlington County Crime Stoppers at 1-866-411-TIPS. That's 1-866-411-8477. As of this episode's recording, the story of Scott Ratigan remains unresolved.